The presidency, Chapter 14, bureaucracy, and Chapter 15, the Supreme Court and other federal courts, primarily the Supreme Court. So let's focus here on Chapter 13, the presidency. So this is a previous estimation from the collection of authors that we have here in the text, looking at President Obama. But really, this is a reflection of the power of recent presidents, so not necessarily just the time of Obama's presidency. And spend some time looking over this quote, but we can really see here the continued rise of power within the institution of the presidency, the executive branch. And so what you can see from that is that the powers of the presidency are different than what the framers of the U.S. Constitution believed that they would be. And that's an ongoing question and debate about our form of government. Has the president gained too much power? Perhaps too much power for one individual to effectively use? And has the legislative branch given up some of it, too much of its power, based on how the structure of the Constitution was developed? So some of the things there to consider overall as you read through this text and look over these notes. Now, one of the ways I think of looking at the presidency is to consider those that have been very successful, and then also look at presidents that haven't been very successful. And so spend some time looking over this list. You will see some variety from these two lists, but generally these are the presidents that you'll see listed as the top 10 presidents, that, again, with a few exceptions. But this is what we'll use for our class here. And the same thing can be said for the bottom 10. Fairly consistently the same presidents that you'll see in almost any list. Notice here from the oath of office, this is what a president is to either swear or affirm. And you can see that what they're asked to do is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So that is what is the task of the president. How best to do that? So another way of looking at that, and this is a graphic photo from the bombing at the Boston Marathon a few years ago, if you remember that. And a former Supreme Court justice made this observation about the Constitution. And this could be a quote that you actually attribute to many different people, but here is Justice Jackson. The Constitution is not a suicidal pact. Are there times in which the president must do what's best for the country as far as the president's concerned that may in some ways be contradictory to the Constitution? That's possible when you look through the powers here of the president. Now, these powers are described in, of course, the Constitution, but how a president carries out these powers might not always fit within the parameters of the Constitution. Primarily looking at the presidencies of individuals like Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, presidents during times of considerable upheaval in our country. Did they do the right thing, suspending habeas corpus by President Lincoln during the Civil War, interning Japanese Americans in camps during World War II for Franklin Roosevelt, And you could look that over and say that's not part of what the Constitution should be, that you should do. But in both cases, you do have judges that also supported the activities of the presidents in those cases. So there you can see the powers of the president through the Constitution. The veto is one that the president uses in some instances and can be generally pretty successful. And you have some presidents that haven't been so successful. Best example of one who's not that successful would be Andrew Johnson, as you see there. But overall, presidents are successful with vetoes. President Grover Cleveland was phenomenal when it comes to his success at vetoes. He had 414 in his first term, and only 2 were overridden. There are limits to the president's power, and it's worthwhile to keep that in mind. You can come up with some other examples of institutions or organizations that limit the power of the president, but here's just a few examples. Congress, bureaucracy, Supreme Court, the public, and the press. Now, this is an interesting issue, and you'll read in your text about the War Powers Act and ways in which Congress should at least be involved in the use of military force around the world, and that the president needs to consult Congress when these activities take place. And here you can see the ways in which the War Powers Act is supposed to be used, and the steps that are supposed to be taken, and then the involvement of both Congress and the presidency on military matters. But there are plenty of cases, and technology may now start to even allow presidents greater opportunities to circumvent the War Powers Act, such as the Libyan hostilities that happened during the Obama presidency. War Powers Act was not used, and the argument made by every president really, but in that case specifically President Obama, that he didn't have to use the War Powers Act. So this is the law, and it was vetoed, overridden, and yet presidents can say it still doesn't apply to them because they're commander-in-chief. So in the Obama administration, during the Libyan hostilities, Libya, a country in North Africa, the Obama administration would come back and say they didn't use military personnel on the ground in Libya. There were Americans on the ground in Libya, but not technically military personnel, at least that was the argument, and that they didn't use military weaponry in Libya. Instead, they used, as you can see in this picture here, something like this, drones, which are continuing to be used a great deal in military matters. So is this a way of saying the president can use the military, can continue to respond in the form of commander-in-chief, does not need to consult Congress, even though that is a law, because it's not exactly within the parameters of the War Powers Act. So there you can see this conflict that goes on between the president and Congress. Now, when we look at who is qualified to be president, it's worth noting that there's minimal amount of qualifications really to be president. And you have a couple of these that are pretty straightforward, very straightforward actually. Either you're above 35 years of age or you're not. Either you've lived in the United States at least 14 years or you haven't. What it means to be a natural born citizen might be another matter. Does it mean that you are born of parents that were U.S. citizens? Or does it mean that you were born within the United States? territory of the United States. We've never resolved this issue. And so we don't know what this means. Many of you, if you follow presidential politics, you know in the last presidential campaign we had a candidate in the Republican Party. He's currently a senator from Texas named Ted Cruz. He was born in Canada. His father was born in Cuba, but his mother was an American citizen. And that was his argument, that he was in fact a natural born citizen because his mother was a citizen, even though he was born in Canada. But we don't know if that's in fact the correct interpretation of this qualification to be president. And we do see here that before we had the Obama presidency, we had a very narrow amount of distinctions there, or diversity, among our presidents. And so just share that with, this has been an institution that the presidents have really not had that much difference when it comes to their ethnicity. And so, or really even for that matter with religion, not much diversity there as well. So that makes the President Obama a pretty unique individual in that case, just by the fact that he was elected and how different he was ethnically than all the presidents we've had before him, and now with President Trump after him. And the late James David Barber wrote a book of this title, Presidential Character, and describing then the ways of looking at personalities in the presidency. And he would argue that it does matter. So not all the presidents have been evaluated through his methods, but we have a few here, and there are 4 different categories based upon energy level and outlook. And it's either active or passive, and it's either positive or negative. And so you have active, positive, active, negative, passive, positive, passive, negative. And I'll show all 4 of those. So active, positive, the best of the personality levels here for a president. And you had Franklin Roosevelt as an example there. So he was active in the job, and he had a very positive outlook of the job, willing to change his methods or his ideas, willing to accept criticism and try something else, willing to admit mistakes, and people in this category are more likely to do that. Passive, positive, and Ronald Reagan. Notice you will see that there are 4 presidents that were in that top 10 category of these different personality styles. So the idea here was, and perhaps this is not accurate, but according to James David Barber's study, he was passive in his level of activity, energy level, but certainly did have a very positive outlook. And so it meant that there were other people that had too much power within his administration. Passive, negative, Dwight Eisenhower in this category. So again, top 10 president, but perhaps not really that excited about being president. Maybe didn't really like being president, and didn't really enjoy all the activities or things that you had to do as president. Then you ought to avoid certain personalities and seek out other personalities. And so Woodrow Wilson was a successful president, and he worked very hard at it, but he had a very negative outlook. And as a result of that, didn't accept criticism, wasn't willing to change, became too stubborn at this job, and led then to some overall weaknesses when it comes to the need to make some changes, especially at the end of World War I and trying to make compromises with the Senate in the agreement of treaties, such as to try to get the League of Nations underway for the United States. Now, here's an interesting question about the power of the president, and does it reflect in some ways here with the role of a general, when generals are in command of armies and having to make big decisions. Probably recognize the person in this picture. This is Napoleon, and maybe Napoleon was just in a negative funk when he was asked this question, but was asked what was the general's greatest attribute in their success, and he said it was luck. So I've always thought about that as say, can we, also, shift that over to the presidency and say, why one president's successful and another one is not. You can come up with all these ideas, personality and judgment and the people that are working for them, and does it come down to luck? I would imagine we'd like to think that it comes down to something more than that, but that's something to throw out there. That what if that's it, right? It's rather deterministic, and just something to ponder there for a president. And so read over pages 521, 526, and there you'll see the different categories of people that are working for the president, the advisors to the president. These are the current people that are made up of these four positions within the cabinet: top department officials, heads of departments, and these are individuals that are with the president on a very frequent basis, far more than other cabinet department heads. And there would be some other people that might be very close to the president, the chief of staff, for example, who's not part of the inner cabinet, or the director of Central Intelligence. But here we have Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, who's also in charge of the Justice Department. These are the current individuals in those positions. And it's also worth noting these are the four original cabinet positions starting out during the Washington administration. It's a very important question to consider: what happens if a president is not able to carry out the roles of the presidency? And that's what the 25th Amendment is in place for. It's been around since 1967. And the way to remove a president, even if a president does not want to be removed, we've never enacted that part of the 25th Amendment. But if a president was physically or mentally unable to do the job, would it not be important to be able to find a way to remove the president? You would have to get many other people within the government, read through this 25th Amendment. It's a complicated amendment on how to remove a president if the president does not make those decisions about his or her position. And it is now relied upon other individuals to say this individual, as president, is not capable of doing the job. On such a dreadful decision to essentially end life as we know it on this planet. And that's what would happen if there was a nuclear war. But it can happen, and it unfortunately could happen within a 30-minute span. And so that's the idea of having someone there to be able to make these decisions. Well, what we're left with and how we'll close this chapter is just to consider how we started it, with the idea of where we're taking the presidency. And there are, unfortunately, I suppose, in some ways, or at least a way for us to think of this challenge. There are many parallels between the United States and the Roman Empire. And Rome, of course, was around for really hundreds of years, and much longer than where the United States has been currently. But Rome started off as a republic, never had one individual getting too much power. And that, of course, and some of us, taking this class are certainly aware in some ways of Roman history and that emergence of Julius Caesar and then other family members after him, primarily Augustus Caesar, which we see here in this picture, this sculpture here. And you started to see that transfer of power over to one individual. And so are we continuing that evolution or progression or digression that's occurring in our country away from a republic and more towards an empire of one individual, giving a great deal of power to one individual? That's a major challenge, and it should be a concern for us to think, is that what we want? Do we want that type of system here in the United States? And that's where we'll end this, looking at the presidency, and we'll be shifting our attention to the bureaucracy in our next recorded lecture.